This week, we also got the first college football playoffs ranking of the season, so everyone's talking about it. Who the first four seeds are. They're going to get the bye in that first round, but with that expanded playoff this year, who's going to get the coveted TV slots? That's what we all want to know. Here to help us break it all down, SBJ's college sports writer, Ben Portnoy, and our producer, Reginald Walker. Guys, thanks for joining Molly and me on the pod.
What's up, guys?
Thanks for having me. I'm fired up.
All right, Ben. Who should get some of these coveted TV spots? Let's break down what the format's going to look like. First off, that first round, you got a Friday night game on ABC, ESPN. Then you got 3 games on Saturday, 12 p.m. TNT, 4 p.m. on TNT, and then Saturday night an ABC, ESPN game. But very important, those 2 afternoon games are going to be going up against the NFL. Who are you slotting where?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, look, obviously it's worth providing the caveat these are going to change, right? Like the rankings are early, still going to see some changes. But if we're circling this right now, to me, Alabama, Texas is the big one, right? Like those are 2 of the biggest brands in college football. I'd argue they're probably 2 of the 4, 5, 6 biggest brands in college football. And they're probably sort of 1 and 2 than they are 5 or 6. That's the easy big one, right? And Notre Dame, Penn State, obviously that's a draw. Notre Dame has national draw no matter where they're at. That's an interesting one. The Boise State, Ohio State matchup, the Indiana, Tennessee matchup are kind of fascinating case studies for the college football playoff a little bit in the sense of, how much can a group of 5 program pull in? Boise State's had some real appeal nationally as far as playing in some of those later time slots. Ashton Genty, their star running back, has been kind of much-watched TV for a lot of college football fans. If they're in the college football playoff, and frankly, something worth noting is that there's a world with the playoff selection committee slotting them at 12. There's a world that a one-loss Boise State team ends up in that 4 seed slot, and a one-loss Big 12 champion ends up in that other slot, playing in that game just because of the way that the setup works. So I think that's a fascinating dynamic at play there. At least that's kind of where I would go, at least at first.
Reggie, who do you think gets that Friday night window? Is that where you want to put Alabama, Texas, or is that where you put maybe Notre Dame, Penn State?
That's the interesting conversation. You think about Alabama, Texas, it's going to draw a big number. The question you have, and that goes back to the point that Ben just made, where do you sort of put the pecking order that includes Notre Dame in terms of that branding level and what eyeballs they bring? This is a program that is an independent. They carry their own national TV network as well. It's going to be very interesting to see how to play that game. Again, looking at it right now with Penn State, another fairly well national brand also. I would argue one of the top 10 brands probably in college football as well. When you look at it from that standpoint, it's something very, very interesting to look at. And let's also keep in mind, yes, we talked about, and Austin, you just mentioned, 2 of these games, the 2 Saturday afternoon games, will be on TNT. They are still produced by and controlled by ESPN. So there's a hand of ABC, ESPN, Disney in that in terms of where they end up as well.
Listen, I want to see Indiana, Tennessee in a good window. Ben, I know you're an Indiana alum, but I am loving the Indiana storyline this season. They're incredible. I've been watching them a lot, and Cinderella story, let's go.
I think that's cool for Ben, but I don't think anybody else really wants to watch Indiana football in a good window. If there is a worst window, that's where Indiana football is going to go.
You really think so? You think an 8-0 team is going to be in the worst window?
Yes, because from a branding standpoint, that's where the battle comes in.
Yeah, and they're not going to be undefeated in my mind. If the Indiana is in a first-round game, you're putting them at noon on a Saturday up against the NFL because there just isn't that national recognition. You want as big a program as you can get in the windows that the college football playoff is going to have to itself. So I want to see either Notre Dame, Penn State on Friday night, or Alabama, Texas, and whatever team doesn't get that matchup, I want that other matchup on Saturday night by itself.
Where do you put the big game up against the NFL? I don't know. I think that's an interesting question, right?
That is another variable. It could go in that 4 o'clock window, so maybe that's where a Notre Dame game goes.
Austin, I also wasn't saying that Indiana deserves the primetime window. I'm saying that's a game I'm excited to watch. So if it's on noon on Saturday, perfect. I don't have to compete with the NFL on it.
Well, if it's you and Ben, that is 50% of this call that is maybe interested in watching that game.
Like Indiana's a fascinating case study. Again, kind of what I was saying before is like you've got a lot of programs that are going to be more involved in the college football playoff than we've had before. That's part of the beauty of the 12-team playoff. A lot of people talked about, but weren't necessarily sure how it would play out. But when you look at ratings perspective, I think it's interesting, right? Like you've got a program like Indiana that has been bad since, well before World War II, and having their best season in history. I mean, I can speak to it as an alum and a lot of friends that are still plugged into it. Like fans kind of don't know how to react. And like Indiana's trying to figure out how to support football. You're going to have programs that aren't necessarily huge rating draws probably end up in the playoff in some capacity, whether that's a Cinderella team.
It's inevitable. And I think the college football playoff, the people running the college football playoff knew that sort of Boise State, Ohio State potential matchup. Those are going to be inevitable.
Guys, let me say this too, because it's very interesting. Listen, Ohio State technically in the current rankings are number 2 in the country. And so from that standpoint, you look at it from that perspective, that's why they're in the 5 slot, because they're not projected as a conference champion as Oregon is. So it's a perfect landing spot, as Ohio State has one of the largest, I believe the largest alumni base in the country. So you add that to the fan base and you put them against a Boise State team. I think that's where they feel like they can sort of make up some of the eyeballs for that game. So I think it could be interesting where they put that one as well, based on that factor alone.
The same sentiment exists with Indiana, Tennessee, right? Like Tennessee fans are going to watch that game no matter where they are. And Tennessee is obviously a huge draw for a lot of networks as well in the same capacity. Like you sort of pair these things up with a bigger brand. And I know that's not exactly how the committee's looking at this, and they're not necessarily ranking this off TV rankings, but like as we're playing this game, like you look at this and see, hey, Tennessee is probably going to be the bell cow in terms of viewership in a Tennessee-Indiana matchup. Same thing with Ohio State and Boise State, to Reggie's point.
I will agree that Tennessee is a big name, but in terms of since we're just projecting out right now based on these initial rankings, Tennessee though is like the 6th best in terms of the TV draws here. I mean, I'm putting Penn State, Notre Dame, Texas, Alabama, and Ohio State ahead of them in terms of being national draws, which is why I would put that game at noon. I would put Ohio State, Boise State at 4 o'clock, maybe get a little more of that West Coast audience, anybody who was going to be watching Boise. And I would put Alabama, Texas in primetime on Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, look, what if you take the Friday night slot and stick Indiana and Tennessee there and make that the Friday night window, right? I think there's something to that of, do you take a game that's maybe not necessarily going to draw up against some other big games and the NFL and everything like that, and stick it in a standalone window? And that becomes, a bigger draw because it's sort of the only show in town. I think there's something to that.
I agree with you, Ben. And we've seen success in the Friday night window with Fox and everything this year. Like Friday Night Football, people want to watch it. Friday Night Lights, come on, it's a hit show. Let's make it a reality.
If you've got an Alabama, Texas, or a Penn State, Notre Dame in this case, right, looking at this week's rankings in particular, if that is a Friday night game, you can almost guarantee a very large number. I'm willing to say definitely above double digits in the millions. And what that does is that allows you to promote like crazy throughout the night, the next 3 games, and then going into the following week once you get to the next round. So the conversation becomes, do you use that to try to draw a big number for a game that maybe potentially the conversation is it's not as big a draw? Or do you slap a huge draw there automatically and use that as a springboard? That's a great conversation. For me, I would put the biggest game I possibly can there, either Alabama, Texas, or Penn State, Notre Dame, with the idea that I'm going to snatch everybody's eyeballs right away off the top of this college football playoff thing. Also, you have to look at the atmospheres and the environments. The home teams in these 2 environments right now, the way you look at it, you're talking about Texas on a Friday night. Big time audience, big time crowd, great atmosphere. Or a Penn State, you're staring at potentially a whiteout with a snow surrounded stadium as well. I think those are 2 things that could factor in from a visual standpoint on television.
Well, a lot of permutations. This is obviously just the first release by the College Football Playoff, something that I'm sure ESPN executives, CFP executives are all going over this week in their war rooms. We'll be paying attention to it. Ben, Reggie, appreciate you jumping on.
Thanks, guys.
Anytime.